Go ahead.
Hello, everybody. So my name is Paul Beckwith. I mostly do climate communication to people via my YouTube channel and my website. I talk about all aspects of climate change, but my specialty is abrupt climate system change, or abrupt climate system mayhem at this point. I've attended 5 COPs, the Conference of Parties run by the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And as you're probably aware, COP28, the 28th version, is ongoing right now in Dubai, United Arab Emirates. It's had a lot of negative press, I think rightly so. And perhaps, people might recognize this year that they need to change the structure of these conferences because they're not really accomplishing much. If you look at greenhouse gas levels, CO2, nitrous oxide, methane rise in the atmosphere. They're rising at ever accelerating rates. And you can plot the years of the COPs, on them. And it just shows you how ineffective they've been. I mean, the main metric is greenhouse gas levels in the atmosphere. James Hansen would like to turn the main metric to the Earth energy imbalance, which is increasing significantly over the last few decades. And as long as more energy is coming into the system than leaving, then the Earth will continue to warm. So the first COP I attended I was contacted by this random person, Stuart Scott. He said, I've been to all the COPs, I've got air miles, why don't you come to Lima? And little did I know he had a polar bear suit, which I wore around the conference for a couple of days in the stifling heat. This was in Lima, Peru in 2014. And then, of course, the big COP, maybe the biggest, arguably, in terms of impact, was the Paris 2015 conference, where 2 degrees was agreed on as a safe threshold for the planet, with aspirations to 1.5 Celsius. I was supposed to go to Santiago for the 2019 COP, and there was rioting, and the infrastructure for public transportation to get to the venue was destroyed in protest a month before. So it was canceled there, and Madrid, Spain took it up and organized a great COP in 2019 in less than a month. Then, of course, there was 1 year where it didn't happen in 2020 during the pandemic. Then I was in Glasgow a few years ago for COP26, and also in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt for COP27, and now we're at COP28. If you look at the number of attendees, it's just exploded in the last few years. So Glasgow may have been 35 or 40,000 people attending. In Egypt, there was about 50,000 people. And this one here, I've seen numbers as high as 100,000 people. So it's just gotten out of hand. It's been growing exponentially, the number of people attending. Also, if you look at the number of fossil fuel people, the fossil fuel lobbyists, in Glasgow, it was about 500 people, which far exceeds the number of delegates from any given country. That increased 25% for Egypt, the next COP, Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt. That was a 25% rise of fossil fuel lobbyists. I think it was something like 640, and that's increased by a factor of 4 this year. So there's almost 2,500 fossil fuel lobbyists at this year's COP. If you look at the number of private jets, last year if you look at jet traffic in Egypt, in Cairo and Sharm el-Sheikh, it was about 315 private jets above normally in those airports, there'd be about 12 private jets per day. I think that the peak day during the COP was about 64 or 62 private jets. And there were 315 in excess of the normal volumes, people attending that COP. This year, with the number of attendees being double, I would expect that number to be much higher, but still it's dwarfed by the number of private jets that attended the Davos 2022, and that was about over 1,000 people. So basically, the numbers now. I see that our regular speaker has arrived. So I'm very happy. If you want to get him on now, I'm perfectly fine with that. We'll let Art decide.
No, I think you should proceed. We'll have to reschedule him.
Okay. Okay. So the number that you often hear, one of the key metrics of the climate is temperature. And other scientists argue that maybe it should really be the Earth energy imbalance, but the temperature is what was decided on, and it goes back to Paris and even before then. And the temperature is, 1.5 and 2 degrees. Those are considered the key numbers. Now, a few years ago, there was a special report by the UN comparing damages to the Earth's systems from 2 degrees versus 1.5. And there's a significant number of feedbacks that are expected to kick in, perhaps tipping points in the climate system between those two numbers. So, the consensus scientifically is that the 1.5 number is key. Now, what do they actually mean by the 1.5 number? So I have to talk about two things. I have to talk about baselines first, and then I have to talk about moving averages and what do they actually mean by saying keep under 1.5. So baselines are important because the baseline that everybody uses right now is 1850 to 1900, the average of global average temperature between those dates. And I call that baseline 2, because when the number is 2 degrees threshold was in 1.5, when those numbers were first talked about by the UN, they referred to the pre-industrial baseline. Like, those are rises relative to pre-industrial. And pre-industrial was never really defined, but the common knowledge for pre-industrial is the year 1750. When people started burning coal to clear out mines, to allow them to mine more coal, et cetera, the steam engines, that's when things really took off, and temperatures have risen since then, but we didn't have a lot of ways to measure temperature back then. And it wasn't a long-term average, like a 30-year average or so. So I call that baseline 1, the original baseline. And so the 2 degrees and was relative to that. But then somewhere about, after around Paris time or slightly before, maybe a decade ago, the new baseline, without mention or fanfare, basically became 1850 to 1900. Now, this is important because if you take the temperature difference, if you look on any graph of temperature rise, you can see, just eyeballing it, you can see about a 0.2 to 0.3 degrees Celsius rise in temperature from 1750 to the 1850 to 1900 average. There is a paper that argues that the number is the difference is more like 0.13 or 1.4. It's in a medical journal. But anyway, the point is we just basically soaked up that, we forget about that 0.2 to 0.3 or the 0.14, whatever. It's never even considered. Now everybody talks about the baseline 2, which is 1850 to 1900. And that's my own terminology, baseline 1, 2, and 3. So my argument is that in order to stay below 1.5, we would have to shift the baseline, create baseline 3, make it 1970 to 2000, call it baseline 3. And then we're only about 0.7, 0.8 degrees above that. And we can talk about 1.5, for quite a bit longer. But basically, there's no possible way, even using baseline 2, we can stay below 1.5. Okay, so this leads you to the question, how long do we have to be above 1.5 in order to say we've exceeded that baseline, that target? that temperature? And there's no clear answer to that, really. Right? You could ask policymakers. I bet you could ask 95% of the people at COP, what do we mean by 1.5 really? Is that like a temperature one day? What's happening in 2023 is that so far, if you go by month to month, it looks like we're going to end up about 1.5 or 1.54 degrees above the 1850 to 1900, in quotes, pre-industrial baseline 2. We're exceeding it this year for 2023. In fact, some individual days we're exceeding 2.0 degrees Celsius. In fact, we've reached about 2.04, 2.05 on several days just in the last few months. I mean, we're setting record temperatures. The temperatures have really spiked up significantly. And I'll tell you a little bit why, based on James Hansen's paper, Global Warming in the Pipeline. But basically, so what do we mean by 1.5? Like, how can we possibly say we're trying to meet this target if we're likely to have an entire year, 2023, above that number? Well, we can talk about a moving average, like a 10-year moving average of temperature, right? That would mean that, we've hit 1.5. So in about 3, 4, 5 years, we're going to hit 1.7 probably. And then if you take the 10-year moving average, we're going to be above 1.5 in about 4 or 5 years. Okay, if you take that sort of average. Other people say, well, let's take a 30-year average. When we talk about a climatological average for weather, for meteorologists or climate scientists, it's a 30-year average. So if we say we have to exceed 1.5 for a 30-year average, then we have to wait about another 15 years or so. Okay, according to James Hansen, we're going to reach 1.7 in a year for a full year by 2030. So within, say, 7 years. And we're going to reach over 2 degrees Celsius for a full year by another few years, by 2038. So 15 years, and we'll have an entire year above 2. Now, of course, nobody experiences the average. When we talk about global average temperatures, the temperature that you experience where you live is going to be quite different, of course. It's really the temperature extremes that are important in terms of resilience of infrastructure and societies, right? It's not, the average never kills anybody. It's a huge swings. It's the extreme or the rate of change of the extremes. So where it is basically the negotiations at the climate conference, you've probably heard that the Emirate of Dubai, one of the sultans, is in charge. He's the COP28 president, and they were awarded, the UAE was awarded the COP at the previous COP, so about a year ago. At the end of this, by next week, towards the end of this COP28, we're going to hear where it is the following year. And the powers that be, the rich and wealthy, and oil companies, they want it to be in Azerbaijan, another oil place, next year. And they also want it to be in Brazil the year after, which makes sense to me, being in Brazil, but not in another, oil nation. So, it's hard to see otherwise, but it looks like, the COP has undergone complete regulatory capture by fossil fuel companies. John Kerry has been saying positive things, having great hopes for this COP, saying that the oil companies need to be in part of the solution. But most people look at it as being, as the foxes being in charge of the hen house, and it being a very bad thing for getting negotiations. And, there's been some quotes where, they're going to argue all week, basically, about should the conclusion of the COP be that we need to phase out fossil fuels? No, they're arguing that we have to phase them down. Phasing them down leaves lots of wiggle room. How much do we phase them down? In all likelihood, we're never going to completely get rid of fossil fuels. There'll still be some, and the idea is that we'll have carbon capture to offset it. So this COP, there's a lot of push about carbon capture at this COP. And there's also talk about solar geoengineering or solar radiation management in mainstream circles. So if you subscribe to The Economist, the weekly magazine, there's a whole section last week about carbon capture removal from the atmosphere and oceans. And they mention, will solar geoengineering be necessary? And they're actually pushing for more research and saying that we're absolutely going to have to do this in order to have any hope of reaching the targets. You know, the talk of 1.5 degrees is basically our, result turning now to overshoot. Okay, we're going to overshoot this target. So as long as we don't stay above 1.5 for very long, if we can cut emissions and get us back down to 1.5, then everything will be fine. You see what I'm saying? Everything is sliding because climate is changing so quickly. So how quickly is climate changing? Well, let's look at James Hansen's paper out, a month ago, Global Warming in the Pipeline. Now, a little anecdote about James Hansen. Originally, I was going to be going to this COP, and Hansen was also going. I decided not to, given all that's been happening in the Middle East, and also with the way this COP is being run and the numbers of people. It just seems like a gong show. I call it Burning Man in the Desert 2.0, right? You know about the Burning Man festival every year that happens in the US? Well, COP28 is really, it's a Burning Man festival. There are more women attending the COPs. If you look at the numbers, the original COP had about 88% men and 12% women in the stats. This COP is supposed to be something like a ratio of 65-35%, men to women. So it's still very much male dominated. So Burning Man in the Desert, is, I think, a perfect sort of view, or, mirage in the desert, right? I mean, it's really being captured by fossil fuel companies. I mean, they had a big announcement on day one about loss and damages. And if you look at the money that they've, it's good that they started this up. These things are all good that they're doing it, but a lot of it is greenwashing. I mean, it's only a small fraction of a % of the damages that are occurring from climate change, the loss and damage. And, countries pledged to have this at the last COP, but it wasn't just a new concept last COP. It was in the works for, a decade, and it never had very much money going into the fund for loss and damage. And the whole idea of climate justice is very important, right? Because most of the cumulative emissions are from Western countries, and the countries that are bearing the worst of extreme weather events, et cetera, floods, droughts, all the litany of climate change evils is the global south and its poorer countries who can least afford to recover from the damages. I mean, I think we're going to reach a point, climate change, some people think civilization is going to collapse, right? I mean, if that was to happen, it doesn't happen overnight. Think of it as death by 1,000 cuts. Climate catastrophes increase at such a fast rate, eventually countries will run out of money to be able to rebuild infrastructure, and people will just be forced to move. I mean, I'm thinking of the city on the coast of there was torrential rains, the rivers were swollen, 2 dams failed, and the burst of water wiped out a coastal city in Africa. Was that Libya? I mean, are those cities really going to be rebuilt? I mean, I look at Gaza, I look at the number of buildings destroyed, 68,000 buildings completely destroyed, 200,000 or 300,000 buildings heavily damaged. Are these ever going to be rebuilt? Because this is sort of like climate change damages accelerated, if you like. I mean, the U.S. military has said, climate change is a big multiplier of bad things that happen. It's a multiplier of instability, right? I mean, it's hard to see. You know, I did a video. I'm not going to dwell on what's happening in the Middle East right now, but I just want to point out I did a video. I called it A Tale of Two Cities, Gaza and Dubai. Okay, so we have in Dubai a massive meeting to supposedly address climate change. We have most of the negotiators and government people. In fact, most of the attendees of the conference they're in the 1%, top 1% of income people, you know, earners or wealthy people in the world. And many of people are being flying private jets, and they're negotiating. You know, any government official or negotiator for a country at this COP, policymakers, they all make decent salaries, much above the norm. In fact, most of them are in the 1%, if not at least in the top 5%. And they're negotiating to try to reduce climate change. But you can see the problem there. The inequality is just huge. In fact, if you talk about inequality, the top 1% of wealthy people in the world produce about the same number of emissions as the bottom 66% in the world. Okay, the inequality is that skewed. But anyway, what does Hansen say about the warming? Okay, up until 2010, the global average temperature was increasing about 0.18 degrees Celsius per decade. That's from about 1970 to 2010. Then something shifted, and from 2010 onwards, the global average temperature has been rising somewhere between 50 and 100% higher than that 0.18 degrees Celsius per decade number. So it's rising between 0.27 and 0.36 degrees Celsius per decade. It's greatly accelerated. So why is that happening? There seems to be strong evidence that the reduction of sulfur in marine shipping fuels around the world for commercial ships that ply our oceans has been tightened significantly. Regulations came in place in 2015 to greatly cut the sulfur in shipping fuels. And then those regulations were tightened an order of magnitude in 2020. And the reason why this has been a problem is because this sulfur that's emitted from ships puts particles in the pristine air over the oceans, and those particles have two effects, an indirect effect and a direct effect. The direct effect is that the aerosols themselves block some of the sunlight and they cool the ocean below. And naturally, there's very, very few particles in the air over the ocean. Over land, there's lots of sources of particles. The particle densities are very, very high. Over the ocean, very, very few. So injecting all of these sulfur dioxide, sulfur aerosols into the atmosphere over the ocean has blocked a significant amount of sunlight. But most of it is from the indirect effect. These particles act as cloud condensation nuclei. The more particles there are, the more the number of small water droplets in the clouds, the low-level cloud. And the Twomey effect basically means that if you've got a lot more particles, water droplets, and the clouds are white and they're highly reflective. You know, over time, the clouds, the particles, the water droplets collide, coalesce, form larger droplets. Eventually, if they become big enough to overcome gravity and rain out. So the lifetime of the cloud disappears, basically. It rains out itself. So the lifetime, when you have much smaller, a lot more cloud condensation nuclei, you have a lot more water droplets, they're smaller, so the cloud is very long-lived, and it blocks sunlight and keeps the ocean below cooler. So it looks like that the cloud fraction over the ocean, these low-level marine clouds, is greatly reduced because of the reduction of sulfur in the shipping fuels. And studies have been done, very good studies have been done on ship tracks and the effect that they have. We used to think you can see them on satellite. And we used to think that the ship tracks that were important were the ones we could see, but there's far more that we can't see, but they're very important. They're just there's not enough to be detected by satellite, but they're there. So the net effect is that the warming rates, so this is the main reason, according to Hansen and his large body of work, as to why the temperature rise has accelerated from 0.18 degrees Celsius per decade to between 0.27 and 0.3 Celsius per decade. Another big factor is possibly the methane, but Hansen doesn't really see that. So Ewan Nisbet has done some tremendous work on methane emissions, how much methane there is, and it's taken off, it's skyrocketed in just the last 2 years. And there's a lot more methane coming from wetlands. Now you may argue, well, fracking and fossil fuel emissions, natural gas is essentially methane, right? So we're liquefying natural gas, shipping it around the world. If leak rates are more than a few percent, then methane is actually worse than coal, or as bad as coal in terms of affecting climate. And leak rates are approaching, 10% in some areas. I mean, we're getting a lot better metrics on measuring this, finding the methane hotspots from projects like TRACE, which is a project that Al Gore has been funding and pushing for quite a few years. I think he's been talking about it even at this COP. So, but the isotopic ratio of the carbon-12 to carbon-13 in the methane and the CH4 indicates to us that the methane is not coming from fossil fuel burning, and it's not coming from northern areas. It's coming from wetlands, mostly in the tropics. Why would that be? Because the hydrology has been changing. We're getting more wetland, more rainfall in certain regions of the world, and these are causing large increases in the wetlands that exist and in the methane production from these wetlands. Okay, so this is the idea. Now Hansen, Hansen doesn't see this yet, but we know since 2007, methane levels have been rising very rapidly. Now, what Ewan Nisbet says in some of his latest work is he's really wondering if we're in what would be known as an extinction event zero for methane. Now, I'll explain what that is. Every time we've gone out of an ice age into a warming period, methane levels have skyrocketed, and they've been kind of a feedback to increase the rate of warming. So we get a little bit of warming, we get methane released to the atmosphere, and we get more warming and more warming. So methane, we have this massive rise of methane as we go from glacials to interglacials. And this has happened each time we've moved from a glacial to an interglacial. And the methane rises are called extinction 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Now, what's different now is we're already in an interglacial, yet the methane, if you track the methane curves of rise since 2007, it seems to match very closely to what the rises of methane are in these so-called extinction events moving from ice ages to interglacials. So if we are, in fact, in that type of event, then we can expect massive rises of methane over the next few decades. And I'm talking about hundreds of parts per billion. So basically, in conclusion, the global average temperatures seem to have greatly accelerated since 2010, an acceleration of somewhere between 50 and 100%, according to the latest research by James Hansen and his colleagues at Columbia in a paper called Global Warming in the Pipeline. We're basically at 1.5 Celsius above the 1850 to 1900 pre-industrial, in quotes, baseline, which everybody's talking about. climate conferences and ad nauseum in reports and everything, people are always talking about how do we stay under 1.5. I mean, we're basically there this year. If you take a 10-year moving average, we'll be there in, about 4 or 5 years. And we'll have a year completely over 2 degrees Celsius, probably by, 2038 or so. So climate change is accelerating, and it seems that this COP28 with 100,000 delegates in the desert has been completely hijacked by fossil fuel companies. So not too much is, I think, expected to come out of this conference. I think conferences, all COPs moving forward, should just be in Bonn, Germany. There's a room that can hold 5,000 people. That should be the absolute limit. And, it's become just a circus, an unwieldy circus that doesn't accomplish anything. So thank you.
Okay, and with that, I would like to thank you very much for stepping up to the plate, Paul, in a very short notice. And with that, I will terminate this recording.